Part 1. The plants you've been killing may be worth more than your garden. Right now, somewhere in your backyard, in the cracks of your driveway, along the border of your garden, or across the lawn you've spent years trying to keep clean, there are plants growing that refuse to disappear. You've pulled them out by hand. You've sprayed them. You've buried them under mulch. And still, every spring, they come back as if they were never asked to leave in the first place. That alone should make you pause, because maybe the real story is not that these plants are stubborn. Maybe the real story is that they were never the enemy to begin with. What if the plants you've been destroying are actually more nutritious than the crops growing in your raised beds? What if the thing you've treated like a nuisance is worth more than the thing you've been carefully watering, feeding, and protecting? That is the contradiction at the heart of this story. We have been taught to see these plants as worthless simply because they grow without permission. But what if their greatest value is exactly that? They do not ask for tilled soil. They do not ask for a seed catalog. They do not ask for irrigation lines, fertilizer schedules, or a gardener's constant attention. They appear, they return, and they survive. This video is about 6 common weeds that most people already have growing somewhere on their property and why they outperform conventional vegetable gardens in ways most people never stop to consider. Not just in vitamins, not just in calories, not just in medicine, but in something even more important than all of those combined: zero input survival. These are plants that cost nothing, need nothing, and come back every year whether you welcome them or not. And once you begin to see them for what they really are, your lawn stops looking like wasted space. It starts looking like a food system you were trained to destroy. Part 2, Dandelion, the weed that outclasses. Kale, let's begin with the plant that is probably growing closer to you than anything else on this list. Dandelion. The weed most people have spent years poisoning is, in many ways, more impressive than kale, one of the most celebrated greens in the modern garden. Long before the herbicide industry convinced people that a perfect lawn was something to be proud of, dandelion was treated very differently. It was not an accident. It was not an invader. European settlers brought it to North America on purpose, as a food source worth carrying across an ocean. That detail changes everything, because a plant people now spray every spring was once considered valuable enough to protect, transport, and establish deliberately. And the reason becomes obvious once you look at what the plant actually offers. And a 100-gram serving of dandelion greens contains an enormous amount of vitamin K. It also provides more beta-carotene than a carrot and more calcium per calorie than a glass of milk. Even more important, every part of the plant is edible. The leaves can be eaten in early spring before they turn bitter. The flowers can be eaten raw or battered and fried. The root can be roasted and ground into a coffee substitute or dried and used as an herbal remedy associated with liver support. What many people dismiss as a lawn weed is, in reality, a whole food plant with multiple uses packed into a single species. Now compare that to spinach. Spinach needs prepared soil, regular watering, protection from heat, protection from bolting, and replanting every season. Dandelion needs none of that. It pushes through compacted ground. It survives frost. It keeps producing from spring into fall. And every year it returns from a deep taproot that makes it incredibly hard to eliminate without chemicals. That is exactly the point. Dandelion does not depend on you to save seed, replant, or maintain it. It saves itself. Every seed head drifting through the air is a reminder that this plant has already solved the problem gardeners spend money trying to manage. It will keep coming back, whether you help it or not. Part 3. Purslane, the land plant that gives you what fish usually does. As impressive as dandelion is, most of what it gives you comes in the form of vitamins and minerals. But the next plant answers a different problem, one that many survival gardens never really solve. Purslane is the weed that fills the nutritional gap most people assume can only be covered by animal foods or expensive supplements. To most gardeners, it just looks like a low, spreading succulent that somehow slipped into the bed where it does not belong. So they pull it out, toss it aside, and move on. What they have just thrown away is one of the most nutritionally remarkable edible plants growing on land. Purslane contains between 300 and 400 milligrams of alpha-linolenic acid per 100 grams. In simple terms, that makes it richer in omega-3 fatty acids than any other leafy green plant on Earth. That matters because omega-3 is one of the nutrients people often assume they need to buy. Many spend money every month on fish oil supplements just to reach the kind of intake this plant can provide for free. And while the modern system packages that nutrition in capsules and bottles, purslane grows quietly in the garden bed, ready to come back again without any effort from you. What people are purchasing elsewhere is already appearing uninvited in the soil beneath their feet. But its real importance goes beyond that. Purslane is a C4 photosynthesis plant, which means it thrives in exactly the conditions that damage or destroy conventional vegetables. Drought, heat, poor soil, and neglect do not weaken it the way they weaken tomatoes, lettuce, or other common garden crops. In fact, those harsh conditions are where purslane reaches peak performance. While other plants wilt, bolt, or turn bitter, this one keeps growing. You can eat it raw in salads, where it has a mild, slightly lemony taste, or cook it in oil, stir it into soups, or pickle it. In parts of Turkey, Greece, and the Middle East, it has long been valued as a cultivated food. But in many backyards today, it is still being treated as trash. It may not deliver many calories on its own, but it fills a nutritional role that potatoes, beans, and squash cannot. It is the supplement people are already growing and throwing away. Part 4. Lamb's Quarters. The forgotten grain crop hiding beside the garden. If purslane fills a nutritional gap, the next plant moves the story into even more surprising territory. Lamb's quarters does not just behave like a wild green, it also carries the legacy of a grain crop that most people no longer recognize. You have probably seen it before, without giving it a second look. Pale green leaves, a dusty white coating on the newer growth, rising out of disturbed soil at the edge of a yard, a garden, or an empty lot. It looks ordinary, it looks forgettable. It looks like the kind of weed nobody would bother naming. But that appearance hides the fact that lamb's quarters was once an important food plant in North America long before modern agriculture taught people to ignore it. Native American tribes across the continent cultivated lamb's quarters intentionally, and they did so for more than one reason. The leaves were useful, but so were the seeds. Those seeds are tiny, dark, and similar to quinoa, which makes sense because the two plants belong to the same family. That means lamb's quarters is not just another edible green growing beside the garden. It is a plant that can also provide a grain-like food source. The seeds can be dried, cooked whole, or ground into flour, and a single mature plant can produce tens of thousands of them in one season. At the same time, the leaves offer more than spinach does in at least one important category: protein. They also contain iron, calcium, riboflavin, and vitamins A and C. In practical terms, it can be cooked the same way spinach is cooked, and its flavor is mild enough that it does not feel like a compromised food. What makes lamb's quarters especially powerful in a survival system is where it chooses to grow. It thrives in disturbed soil, the kind of ground found near construction sites, vacant lots, roadsides, and especially around the edges of freshly worked gardens. If you have been building raised beds or turning over soil, there is a good chance lamb's quarters is already appearing nearby. And once it arrives, it tends to stay. It self-seeds aggressively enough that it can establish itself for the long term without any help at all. That creates an uncomfortable comparison. While someone may be spending money on spinach seeds, preparing beds, dealing with pests, and replanting every season, lamb's quarters may already be doing the same job a few feet away for free. And that is where the story starts to widen, because the next plants on this list do not just feed you, they move into something most garden advice rarely talks about at all: medicine. If the weeds you ignored can already give you vitamins, omega-3s, protein, and even grain-like seeds, how much value has been hiding in plain sight this whole time? Part 5. Wood sorrel, the overlooked vitamin C source in the lawn. The story becomes even more interesting here, because the next plants on this list are not valuable only as food. They also enter a category that most survival garden conversations barely touch: medicine. And wood sorrel is a perfect example of that forgotten overlap. At a glance, most people mistake it for clover. It has the same low habit, the same delicate feel, and leaves that seem familiar enough to dismiss. But wood sorrel is not clover, and overlooking that difference means overlooking one of the better wild sources of vitamin C that may already be growing in the lawn right now. Its sharp, sour, almost citrus-like flavor comes from oxalic acid, the same compound that gives rhubarb its tartness. That sourness is not just a taste, it is part of what signals the plant's value. Vitamin C becomes especially important in diets that rely heavily on stored grains and starches, because fresh plant material is often the first thing to disappear in those conditions. Historically, that absence mattered enough to become deadly. Scurvy was not caused by a lack of calories. It came from the lack of fresh foods that could supply what the body was missing. Wood sorrel belongs to that category of small, easily ignored plants that can quietly fill a gap people do not notice until it becomes serious. What makes it even more useful is where it grows. Wood sorrel does well in partial shade, in the spaces where many other edible plants struggle, under trees, along north-facing fence lines, and in the darker edges of garden beds. It occupies the dead zones that usually get written off as unproductive. It is one of the first plants to push out fresh growth in spring and one of the last to disappear in fall. You can eat it raw, scatter it into salads for brightness, or use it anywhere you want that lemon-like sharpness. Even children are drawn to it instinctively because of that sour taste, which says something about how naturally recognizable it is as food. And like every other plant in this story, it comes back on its own, year after year, asking for nothing. Part 6. Clover, the nitrogen factory. You've been mowing down wood sorrel, maybe small, but the next plant changes the scale of the conversation completely. Clover does not just offer something edible. It improves the ground beneath your feet while it grows. That alone makes it different from almost everything people usually imagine when they think about food plants. Red clover and white clover are nitrogen-fixing legumes. Their roots host bacteria that pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and deposit it into the soil. It is the same basic process that makes beans useful in crop rotation, except clover does it as a perennial, over a wider root zone, and without asking you for any work at all. A thick patch of clover in a lawn is not just sitting there. It is actively rebuilding fertility in the soil below it every season. That is why clover used to be treated very differently. Before synthetic fertilizers became common, farmers planted it on purpose to restore worn-out fields. It was not an unwanted intruder, it was a useful crop. Only later, when industrial nitrogen replaced biological nitrogen in the public imagination, did clover begin to look like something that needed to be cut down and erased? But once you understand what it is actually doing, that shift starts to feel backward. People are mowing away a living fertilizer system that would have once been considered valuable enough to plant deliberately. Its edible and medicinal value is stronger than most people realize. Young clover leaves can be eaten raw in small amounts, and the flowers of both red and white clover are edible fresh or dried. Red clover flowers in particular have a long history in herbal use as a source of isoflavones, compounds studied for possible effects on hormonal balance and cardiovascular health. Even the economics tell a story. Dried red clover flowers are sold by herbal retailers for real money, while the same resource may already be growing across the lawn for free. The seeds can also be sprouted indoors during winter, producing fresh greens in just a few days when very little else is available outside. And while you are harvesting from it, the plant keeps spreading, keeps fixing nitrogen, and keeps flowering without any intervention from you. If a plant can feed the soil, feed you, and return every year without being planted again, then why have we been taught to treat it like something worthless? Part 7. Chickweed, the earliest spring food. Your garden can't beat everything on this list has been useful so far, but chickweed goes one step further. It does not just provide nutrition, and it does not just survive neglect. It arrives at the exact moment when a food system is most vulnerable. Chickweed, or Stellaria media, is the small, sprawling plant with tiny white star-shaped flowers that begins appearing in dense mats in late winter and very early spring. In many temperate climates, it starts growing in February or March, weeks before the last frost date, and long before most cultivated vegetables can be started safely outside. That timing is not a small advantage, It is the reason this plant stands apart from the rest. In any real food security situation, the most dangerous stretch of the year is late winter into early spring. That is the gap between what has been stored and what can be newly harvested. It is the period when supplies are thinning out, but the garden still has not begun producing. Chickweed fills that gap naturally. It grows when almost nothing else will. It produces a thick mass of edible material without any inputs. And unlike many wild plants people force themselves to tolerate, it actually tastes good. Its flavor is mild, slightly grassy, and close enough to baby spinach that it feels familiar rather than extreme. Nutritionally, chickweed brings vitamin C, calcium, magnesium, and iron. Historically, it was also used as a poultice for skin irritation and minor wounds, a use tied to its anti-inflammatory properties. That makes it more than just another early green. It is part of a much older tradition in which food and medicine were never fully separated. And what makes chickweed especially valuable in the system this video has been building is that it grows in the same overlooked places as the rest of these plants: garden borders, disturbed soil, lawn edges. It does not compete with summer crops because by the time those crops need the space, chickweed is already fading back. In other words, it occupies a window in the calendar that cultivated plants usually cannot reach. That would already make it useful, but chickweed goes even further. It self-seeds heavily, with a single plant producing hundreds of seeds, and those seeds can remain viable in the soil for years. Once chickweed establishes itself in a garden, it becomes part of that place for the long term. It returns again and again, offering fresh greens at the very moment when fresh food is hardest to find. And that is what makes it more than a weed. It is a seasonal answer to one of the most fragile points in the entire growing cycle. Part 8. The free food system. Most people pay to destroy. Now step back and look at what this really adds up to. 6 plants. Not one of them costs money. Not one of them depends on a seed catalog, prepared beds, irrigation systems, or specialized growing knowledge beyond simply learning how to recognize them. And together they provide an astonishing range of value: omega-3s, vitamin C, protein, calcium, iron, medicinal uses, early spring greens, summer resilience, and even soil fertility through nitrogen fixation. What most people call weeds are not random intruders in the yard. They are a functioning food system that has been trying to establish itself for years, often without permission and always without help. That is what makes the irony so sharp. The average American household spends hundreds of dollars a year on lawn care, and a meaningful share of that money goes toward killing exactly these plants. People are paying to destroy free food, free nutrition, and in some cases, free medicine, simply because they have been taught that a clean lawn matters more than a resilient landscape. And underneath that habit is an even deeper misunderstanding. The fragile system is not the weeds. The fragile system is the one we protect instead. It is the one built on supply chains, purchased inputs, seasonal seed orders, and the constant assumption that stores, catalogs, and infrastructure will always be there when we need them. The weeds are the durable system. They are the ones that survive frost, drought, neglect, poor soil, and repeated attempts to erase them. They survived long before modern gardening culture existed, and they will survive long after many of its assumptions fail. So the question is no longer whether these plants can feed you. They already can. The real question is whether you are willing to see them differently, whether you will keep treating them like invaders or finally recognize them as allies. And once you do, the next question becomes just as important. Which cultivated crops actually belong beside them? Which crops fill the calorie and storage gaps without duplicating what wild plants are already providing for free? That is where the story leads next.